We'll do this sort of introductory bits while Steph gets set up. Steph's going to do a note to the meeting for us, just because obviously we need to have a record for it that we can refer back to if we need to. So obviously introduced who we are, you know who I am. Helen's Executive Director for a long list of things, but basically everything we do in relation to enforcement, compliance, all these sorts of cases, and we've got 40 live cases at the moment, or is it more than 50 at the moment? Yeah. Thank you very much, Lucy. In terms of what we'll do, so a couple of things to say about today. First of all, realise this could be quite a difficult conversation at times. We're not unaccustomed to sitting down in groups that have had very difficult experiences, particularly some of our lived experience, family members who have had some really traumatic things happen. If at any point we need to take a break and step away, then we can do that, just say so, it's not a problem. If we need to, we've got access as well to people that can be contacted for help and support. I'm hoping that won't be necessary today, but still the offer is there. I'm sure everybody would do this anyway, but we will be as open and candid as we possibly can. There might be a couple of things that you ask us about that we can't comment on if they're in relation to ongoing proceedings or work that's been done under the regulator, etc. I will go as far as I can with you though. Because obviously there's a lot of stuff you can't say on Twitter. And it's very difficult to explain some things, but obviously in the room it's a lot easier to go through that. I'm sure we'll keep the tone reasonable and we'll avoid accusations and all that sort of stuff. I'm sure everybody will, but given the way social media has been, you'll understand why I bring that point. We won't disclose anything about your personal circumstances, your names or anything else, so I would probably tweet afterwards to say we've met, which will come as a surprise to anybody involved in Football Index. But I won't name anyone, say anything about anyone's circumstances. We're obviously bound by GDPR, etc., so we don't disclose anything, we don't disclose documents, we don't disclose anything, which is perfectly normal, but I just make that point today. So anything you do say isn't something that we then share, just so you've got that peace of mind, basically. Steph will take a note and record the meeting, and we'll say that's just in case anyone needs to refer back to it at a later date. Given the possibility of legal proceedings, what I don't want to happen is anyone to say something was said and disputes it. I'm sure we won't need it, but again, that's
it makes sense.
That's there sort of belt and braces. We'd actually planned this meeting quite a long time ago, but it wasn't sensible to try and do it until the report had come out, because you'd spent the entire time asking questions, and I'd spent the entire time going, that'll be the report. And much as I would have...
A bit like your Twitter.
A bit like Twitter. It is very, very difficult, because actually the report itself was delayed 3 times in terms of publication. So we'd had the maximisation process, so we knew what the findings were, but we couldn't disclose anything, because it's not our report to disclose. So it's quite difficult then, when you're being asked questions for which you've got an answer. It may not be regarded as a satisfactory answer, but you can't say anything. So we decided it was better to wait until the report was out, people had a chance to digest it, see what the questions are, and then see what we can do to help in terms of understanding. Obviously you sent the letters through. I'd seen quite a lot of them online already. You know that I pay attention to what's there. I just don't comment or engage on a lot of things because it doesn't help anyone. From my perspective, Helen's perspective, everyone in the Gambling Commission, there's no doubt about the devastating impact of what's happened to people. Nobody doubts that. Nobody doubts that in the slightest. What's clear in the letters, but it's consistent with what we've seen over quite a long period of time now, is just how hard hit people have been, the large amounts of money people have lost, and people go, we didn't lose our bets. I get that, I'm not saying anyone did, but the money's lost, or mostly lost in terms of what's happened with the company, and the impact of that's going to be devastating for people, and we know that. What I thought I would say about what we will and won't do today is I wanted this to be an opportunity for us to explain things that might not be clear to you. And there are some things circulating in social media where I think the regulatory position, how other things work, has been misunderstood, but it's almost impossible to try and correct that in social media. And you get shouted down, people dispute it. So in a sense, there's more sense of engaging in there. We would like to be able to do some of that today. You'll have some specific questions or things that aren't clear, or why did we do things, why did we not do things, how did the timing work. We're very happy to explain as much of that as we possibly can. I don't have an expectation you're going to walk out of the building today feeling fine with everything, or being happy with everything, or feeling well disposed to the gambling commission. I'm not trying to take your views away from you or argue about anything. I just want to make sure that we've told you as much as we possibly can that helps you understand things. How you feel about that afterwards is obviously for you. We said in the original letter that the legal position around what we call redress, but there is no compensation scheme, there is no insurance scheme, there is no government funded backup. There are, for certain products out there, elements of financial services, travel industry's got some industry-owned ones, but as per an administration process, government doesn't have a financial bank, and we don't hold funds anyway. A lot of the funds people assume we receive, we actually don't. I'll just say a little bit about the Gambling Commission itself. We're not taxpayer funded. We're funded through two streams. One is licence fees from operators who pay us to be licensed. The other is for regulating the National Lottery. So we receive funds from the National Lottery to pay for the regulation option of the National Lottery. Those two funds cannot have a mix legally, and that's where our income comes from. So it's constrained by the licence fee, so we can't turn that up or down.
So in terms of fines and regulatory settlements then, are they paid directly to the Treasury?
So fines are paid direct to the Treasury, regulatory settlements are held by the operators, and then there's an assessment scheme which distributes the funds. The funds are actually distributed by the operator, they're never received by the government.
Okay. Thank you.
So, and they have to be distributed to certain things, so we don't have flexibility over where they go. That's not something that we can't sort of go one redirect and something else. Since 2017-18, is it 102 million fines and reg settlements?
Yeah.
But we don't receive those. We don't hold any of that.
Do you know what the split is between fines and settlements?
Not
Approximately.
We can send that.
Yeah, just wondering what it'll be. Okay.
It's well, no, I'm not going to start.
No, that's fine. I wouldn't expect all the answers
I
today.
don't know what the two is.
Did you see my tweet on that subject then, in terms of what fines and settlements both yourselves and the FCA?
Yeah, I've seen all of that.
You've seen all that, yeah.
Yeah,
So there's obviously plenty of money in terms of
Well,
not directly under your purse strings,
yeah.
but there's plenty of money that is set out by the operators in terms of where licensees or financial services companies do not actually adhere to the rules and regulations you set up.
I can see why you've alighted on that. I'll say a bit about that in a second. So
Okay, thank you.
all I was going to say is afterwards, as I say, I may well just say that we've met. I don't intend to comment any further on anything else because I don't think we will have anything in terms of what we have. So
In terms of the meeting today, or in terms of the next?
slightly more generally, yeah. I mean, if there is something I think I need to comment on, then I will. But right now, given where we are, things are in the hands of the Insolvency Service I spoke to this week. There is nothing I can productively say. People will just go round in a circle, and people get angry at that. That's not happening. So I don't intend to say anything further, mainly because I don't think there's a lot I can really add. I've just been repeating myself. So I don't think that helps anyone. As I say, I'm hoping today that it will help you with some further understanding of things that you may not be aware of. As I say, you're not necessarily going to find that a happy thing, but you should hopefully know what you did when you came in. And that's how I was hoping to take things through today. As I say, both Helen and I will be as candid as we possibly can. We'll go further than you will have seen us go before, partly because it's easier to do that in a discussion, but it's impossible to do that with thousands of people on social media. You just can't. And you get people sort of having their own take and their own reinterpretation. It's impossible. Which is why a couple of you I know directly ask me questions, and some of it it's just too difficult to try and engage with. That's why I thought today would be a better idea. I'll just say something on reg settlements and fines. So fines go directly to Treasury and be dispersed. So there isn't like a war chest of 100 million sitting there for the last couple of years. All of that disappears. Reg settlements, there's actually a relatively small amount sitting with operators, which has to be distributed to certain types of causes around gambling harms, research, support, that sort of thing. So if you're, I don't know, with the FCA would be fines into the Treasury. I don't know a lot.
Yeah, of course, yeah, I appreciate that.
That's how theirs will be handled. I don't think they do settlements, but from our perspective, there isn't a war chest sitting there. Regardless of that, you'd expect me to say this. That's not something we have control over redirecting, and I wouldn't comment.
Based on what you said to start with, I understood that.
But essentially, any receipts the Treasury receive as a result of those fines is a net gain to the Treasury because they're not funding you in any way.
That would be right, yeah. There would be a net gain to the Treasury in the sense that they don't fund us, but they would receive fines, but obviously the level of fines is unpredictable.
Sure. I mean, we don't know whether hopefully you can report back, but that's
and obviously the Treasury will have estimates each year of what it's going to receive in fines from the various regulators that levy fines. Not all do, but and they will have assumptions and put that into their spending plans.
So that's a political decision, not one versus.
Yeah, it's nothing to do with us. Yeah, it's not something we will comment on. So sometimes we get asked about it. It's one of those ones that we just wouldn't comment on because it's what we don't. So what would you like? Where would you like to start? Something you want to ask about?
I guess at the beginning. So when Football Index first applied for a license, what is your understanding of what license was granted and how that related to the product that they showed you they were offering?
Okay.
And we can sort of take it from there.
Yeah, that's fine. So I think, Helen, you better off explaining that. I'll just try and explain one other thing first, because I think it might become important. But stick with me for a second. One of the things that's been commented on is whether Football Index was doing things which were not licensed. So that is true. Football Index was doing things which we do not give a license to. But there are things that an operator can do which are neither licensed or unlicensed. They're not covered by legislation. There are several products out at the moment not regulated by us, not regulated by the FCA, not regulated by anyone, who offer services similar to elements of Football Index.
But they're unregulated.
Yeah.
But once regulated, would you say that any regulator has a responsibility to ensure that...
Step before that, this is why I want to explain this bit to you. So when you regulate something, you regulate the elements of that product which come under your regulation. You cannot extend your regulation to things within their product which are not covered by legislation. So you can have, and we've got this now with quite a few operators, where there are elements of what they do which are covered by the Gambling Act, and there are elements directly interacting with that product which are not, and we have no regulatory authority over that.
Can you give an example?
I can. There's the one that we're in the legal stages to talk about.
Well, you're related to Football Index.
Specific to Football Index, from day one, what were they doing that was regulated by you, and what were they doing that wasn't regulated by you?
Day one, well, do you want to do
So
it?
day one they had a general betting licence, and that evolved in 1890. So in broad terms, the betting part, the stakes part, was regulated by us. The shares part was the aspect that we didn't have regulatory remit over.
And can I ask, the licence was granted for a fixed odds bet, as I
It's the
understand.
general betting licence, yeah.
Was that in relation to fixed odds though?
Yeah.
So, what's your understanding of what is a fixed odds bet? I'm not
So-
I'm just so we can define it.
Well, I would refer to our regulations and the Act. So, but what I can tell you is that was the product that was licensed. It was
No, I'm just
properly
asking
licensed.
for. Sorry to interrupt. I'm just trying to understand what you understand to be a fixed odds bet.
Okay. So, are you asking in relation to bet index or just?
No, it's a general definition. What is a fixed odds bet?
So a fixed odds bet is when you place a bet, you've got odds that you could win or lose, and you can work out what you could receive as a result of that. So I think we all know what.
Well, no, I asked that. I mean, clearly for a reason.
Okay.
So you would agree, I presume, that you wouldn't be able to vary the odds on a fixed odds bet,
Significant.
or in any way.
Not on a fixed. I mean, odds do vary, as we know.
Oh no, of course. But once a bet is struck,
Well, yes. Once
the
you place
if it's a
bet,
fixed odds bet,
Yeah.
then that would the
On
odds
your-
on that bet
your
would remain the
stake,
same.
Yeah.
So how does that tally with their terms and conditions, which says that they can vary the odds on that bet?
So there were changes to the product in terms and conditions post license application.
Yeah, but
So-
that license
so-
application, there was no requirement for them to have consistent, for them to be able to fix, for them to have to fix the odds. It was well within their power to change the odds of whatever they wanted under their terms and conditions.
So there was some ability, but the terms and conditions upon a license application aren't examined in sort of that forensic detail. So you look at suitability, you look at financial
Okay.
stability.
Can I just,
And
sorry.
if I
No,
could
you
finish,
can. Please.
So the additional regulations post grant in 2015 with consumer protections actually assisted us in that aspect on the sort of fair and open licensing objective.
Right, can I just, tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like we were going down a path where you were saying that certain products can be regulated, certain products aren't regulated, and certain products can have elements of both. And then we touched on something else, but I think that's helpful. I'd like to I've got a list of questions which are related to the licensing stage in terms of what you actually did license that was regulated before there were any elements of any unregulated aspects of the product. So this is just purely looking at what you licensed, which was a regulated product. So how did you feel comfortable that customers placing bets were fairly, in terms of being fair and open, that they would fairly expect to receive winnings over the 3-year term of the bet? And how can a 3-year bet be fair without a reasonable assurance that winnings can be paid out over the 3 years?
So one of the things we had assurance around was the financial stability. So whilst we don't look at sort of economics, we're not an economic regulator who will look at, is this business going to be financially stable? Will all the bets be covered? Some businesses will go bust. It's unusual for a gambling business to go bust. It happens, and there will be losses. But we were confident and assessed there was financial stability. There was therefore the ability to pay back, and that remained the case. There was reserves and a payback percentage right up until 2020.
Okay, so did you require them to have a day one liability reserve to cover the liabilities?
No, that's not part of our requirement. So if you look at the Regulatory Framework and Act, stepping right back, you start off that we're regulating a leisure activity. So we're a regulator who is regulating a largely leisure activity. We're not an economic regulator. We don't do real-time financial monitoring. So we're very different to your economic regulators, your FCA, which is Solicitors Regulation Authority.
Okay.
So we've got a £19 million budget, 300 plus people, 2,000 currently 600 operators. We're not doing that real-time financial.
I understand.
We don't require insurance.
But do you do? I mean, you say. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
I mean,
not at all.
you say you don't do real time, but presumably you do spot checks on a regular basis with businesses.
So in terms of the way we handle regulations, we are a licensing authority which grants the license. We will then assess people based on risk. Risk is largely driven by gross gambling yields, so how much money they are making at any given time, because that's where the risks are to increase. We then have an intelligence-led approach, so depending on the number of complaints we get, other regulatory complaints like the ASA, etc., and various other things that our team detect. We detect then whether we bring to intervention. But we don't have the sort of, when you talk about spot checks, we haven't explained exactly how it works, but it isn't in the way that banks would be spot checked on holding capital because the regulations are different. So the way we're funded is based on the regulations. We can't freestyle and add things in.
But could you, sorry.
Can I just,
So,
can I just have like 10, 15
yeah,
minutes?
of
just to
course.
go
No,
through,
please.
because this
Yes.
will answer probably a lot of our questions.
Sorry,
So
sorry.
I appreciate we've gone forward to spot checks. I just want to really narrow down on the very beginning. And what I didn't understand was you get an application, they say the product is this. You have a responsibility to make sure gambling is fair and open. The bet payouts are over 3 years. I mean, you're able to impose conditions on operators. Does it not seem a reasonable condition to require them to have a reserve to make the payouts over 3 years, especially in the context of this being in relation to outcomes and liabilities which have never existed before? It's not like you're pricing up Man U v Spurs, you're pricing up 200 markets on a buzz algorithm which has never been used before over 3 years. So in order to make sure gambling is safe, fair and open, I mean, it would seem to me a reasonable condition to require them to have the ability to have a reserve. So that's what I'm just not understanding.
So the reason I started out saying leisure, size, FTE, budget, is not to step away from all of the things we could do, because we absolutely have the powers to impose conditions and we could impose those conditions. But with such a, and I also don't want to step away from the fact we said right from the outset we should have drawn a line underneath this at an earlier stage.
Well, this is the licensing. This is actually
Yeah,
at 2015.
No,
we'll get to drawing the line later, I'm sure. But in terms of licensing,
Can I just finish?
okay.
Because I absolutely understand the question. I'm just trying to give a full and complete
Sure.
answer. Because otherwise the answer would be yes, we could do that, impose that condition. But the point is, why didn't we, why wouldn't we? With such a small resource and a large industry, we have to take, as Andrew referenced, a risk-based approach to our regulation. So, as I said, we can't forensically examine every single application and every single operator and do that kind of real-time monitoring and imposition of particular bespoke conditions to each operator. Nor could we, nor would it be proportionate, nor in adherence with our statement of principles and our framework to just automatically apply conditions. So what we do is focus on those largest operators, and we do thematic reviews, and obviously post-review we are taking, we've included in our framework a very close eye on any novel products coming through, of which BetIndex was one. But as a small operator, as it was for the first 2 or 3 years since license, we wouldn't have taken that forensic regular monitoring and oversight.
Okay, I appreciate what you said. I'm not talking about regular oversight. I'm just talking about an assessment of a product. And I appreciate you said risk assessment, but I mean, there has to be some sort of assessment over any license. It's not like someone comes to you with a piece of paper and you sign it off. So I'm just talking about a basic assessment of the product.
Yeah, so we'd look at suitability of the people, we'd look at the finances. With hindsight, would we have imposed that condition? I generally think we wouldn't, because it wouldn't have been in our higher risk at that point.
Okay, can I ask? I just want to repeat. 200 markets in over 3 years.
that was growing. That was initially day one.
Initially on an algorithm that's never been used before. So these are brand new markets. I mean, how did you think they would get comfortable? How are you comfortable with them pricing up liabilities or operating markets? I mean, what? I mean, I don't understand how you can look at that and not see the obvious, issues.
Risk.
Yeah, the risk, okay.
Regardless of whether it's large or small, I'm just talking about the product.
Because surely the risk of, I know there's been some high-profile breaches from Flutter in the last couple of days, in the last couple of weeks, but surely your likes of Bet365 are now far lower risk than a novel product coming through. So I did read that BetIndex very quickly got into your top 10 of gross gaming yield. That's what the Sheehan report mentioned. About being top 10.
No, so it wasn't quickly, and they didn't ever reach our top 50.
Can I just as an add-on, can I ask, and you won't be able to answer this now, how long between them applying for a license was how long did it take to grant the licence? Can you find that out for us?
2 months.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Our sort of standard timescales are on the website, but they're just indicators, so I wouldn't have the specifics, but we can get that to you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've got anywhere with that. Let's move on. So,
Just in terms of that, I mean, you mentioned algorithm and 200 markets. How did they end up with a fixed odds gambling on a real life event? Because these weren't real life events. These were a daily table published on 25 media outlets with sentiment scoring, which wasn't visible to us initially. That isn't a real life event. It isn't a goal, Liverpool scoring the first goal against Man U.
Yeah.
So how did they end up with a real life event licence, and with hindsight, what should they have ended up with?
They were correctly licensed with the general betting remote.
No,
They were correctly
not according to your
licensed.
website. Not according to your website. They were licensed for gambling on real life events. Index Labs in 2016 were around software and remote licensing, which again would be interesting to know what they put into their application around what the market they were licensed, what the market was that they were actually starting or taking over from Bet Index in 2016. But the initial license, and I've lived and breathed this for 7 months, was for real life events. And I don't think that anything that Football Index offered was a real life event until IPDs, in-play dividends, which were your 30-day bonus. For the first 30-day ownership, you got paid immediately within a day for goals and assists and clean sheets for goalkeepers. Was it?
Yeah.
A real life event. So again, it sounds like we're kind of jumping on you, but again, it just to me indicates that the initial assessment was flawed and was not fit for purpose.
You were arguing that we shouldn't have licensed it at all then? Is that
well, we're trying to explore that. I think.
Yeah.
There's some
Yeah.
more questions as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's
So,
what you're saying, shouldn't have licensed them at all.
Well, we're asking. I mean, we're asking you to consider it.
So-
I don't think that's quite the same thing as
I
saying.
mean, just
I know, but also, I'm not taking that in a, it's an open conversation.
No,
So
absolutely, you're right to ask, yes,
so
absolutely.
I understand that's what you're asking, and that's your contention.
But you might be making an assumption that means it would never have existed. I'm not sure that would be true.
I'm not making any
well, there's
assumptions.
multiple possibilities
I'm not making an assumption
in the
at all.
spectrum. There's a not licensed with conditions, which I think you can agree we've got distance between the points about liability reserves and things like that, and then the way it was licensed. There's 3 options, right?
And then, of course, once it's licensed, the way it was regulated, and what responsibility you have as a regulator to ensure that.
Exactly, and whether the type of regulation that you can exercise
Yeah.
would have been adequate for a product like this, and I think that's another consideration to
Because
license.
I mean, in hindsight, the fact that they radically changed the product, and that you seemingly didn't realise that. I mean, I don't know whether or
No,
not
we
you
weren't notified, and we weren't therefore aware.
Yeah.
I mean,
So, was there? We mentioned the business plan and the finances. Was there any indication in the finances, which you have checked because you said that they had the ability to pay back the shares for a certain degree? Was there nothing in the business plan or in the financial forecasts which showed the commission? Was it all based on bets being issued for a 3-year term and media dividends being the only expense in terms of payouts to gamblers? Because what I can see from Bet Index is that they actually came to you in 2018 and told you what they were doing, and again in 2019. So did they mislead you in 2015 in terms of the business plan, the financial forecasts, or were they just not read properly?
So when you say they came to us in 2018 and 19 and told us what
They told you what they were doing
in,
in terms of trade, in terms of trading
Well-
trading shares.
when you say they came to us, in what sense? Report it to us?
They reported to you, yes, put it in writing. So it's in the Sheehan report. I mean, I can get to that.
So there was this, it was noted in the security.
You didn't find out that they were doing this. They came to
Yeah.
you in terms of a security audit, I think,
That's
and also a license for a Malta-based intermediary. This is how you picked up on it. So I think my question is fair. On day one, in terms of the assessment of launching a novel product, a new company, a new type of of BET, did they hold their hands up and say, we are actually earning commission as part of our income, or did they pull the wool over your eyes in 2015 and keep that totally from you?
So we were aware that they were earning commission in relation to.
How would they be earning commission?
When were you aware of that?
Hang on. Then we'll end up chopping back and forth and not answering this properly. Then
Sorry,
that's what
they can't.
So let
That's okay. So I'd have to revisit precisely the application papers to see how they advised around commission and exactly when. In relation to the security audit, so we get security audits from all remote or online operators, and that's around compliance with accreditation. So we would look at any security audits that show non-compliance. We wouldn't look at them in relation to reporting. So we've got a key event reporting where people would report things like changes to the product, and that's the mechanism that Bet Index should have used to report changes, and that would have flagged and we would have seen that. To report it by the security audit, which showed compliance with accreditation, we didn't therefore pick up on that specific, because the purpose of the security audit shouldn't have been to notify the changes.
Unless they did put it in the business plan and it wasn't read.
Sorry?
Unless it was put in the business plan in 2015 and not read, and therefore they didn't think they had to do a key event. But they probably should have done based on, additional dividends
Key
later on.
events are part of the regulatory requirements, so they should have known that they should have reported changes via a key event.
By the sounds of it, and forgive me if this, it sounds to me as though, as a regulator, you essentially, the way you regulate is to wait for people to tell you they've done stuff, rather than actually actively seeing that they've done stuff. So, I mean, again, just purely from a very simplistic point of view, as I would imagine a regulator being someone who would proactively regulate whatever it is they're being asked to regulate. But what you're saying here is that you weren't aware of the changes to the product because they didn't tell you.
So we regulate both proactively and reactively. So we'll undertake compliance assessments and they're proactive. But we will also receive information, for example, key events. We might receive information from the police, our confidential hotline,
Sure.
press, all sorts. So that will be all our reactive work, but we will also do proactive. So if you've got the security audit that's for a purpose around accreditation, we just look at those that show non-compliance in that.
How often do you do compliance audits?
So just a step before that, I think, so there are lots of different regulators, different legal frameworks, different funding mechanisms, different requirements of what we do. So your question's a fair one. You imagine a regulator is going out and watching and looking and searching. Given we've got 2,600 operators, actually our remit is to license gambling and then to make sure it stays within those license requirements. But the funding gap and the regulatory framework is not the same as a watchdog type regulator. And I've worked in other regulators where they're not constantly monitoring and going out and checking and looking for other things. So we work on an intelligence basis. Having said some of the pointers that come to us, if something doesn't come in through those, then there is always a possibility there was something emerging and operators not told us about, which they're legally required to tell us about, but then it doesn't get detected until later on.
But I mean, so how often do you do compliance audits?
So we do compliance assessments. We've constantly got compliance assessments being.
No, for an individual firm. I mean, is it once a year, once every 6 months? Is it ad hoc, or how do you?
Okay, so that's where we come back to our risk base. So we'll look at those largest operators. We've got pretty regular engagement with those operators. We'll then do thematic. So we look at casinos, for example, and then for smaller operators, we've done operator workshops because that's around getting them up to compliance or giving information and guidance. But we don't have a system, we don't have a process where we assess every one of our 2,600.
So, for example, you wouldn't look at.
If I can just finish, I'm really happy to be as open and help as much as I can. But the reason I want to finish and be clear is because I don't want, for example, partway through you said, so you won't only do reactive work. Well, no, we absolutely don't. So we do not have a process whereby we regularly or ad hoc visit all of our 2,600. It was back a couple of years ago, 2,800 operators. We just simply don't have the resource. So that's why we have to take a risk approach. It's what lots of regulators do. And it's why the novel products, we have post this issue, and you're obviously very familiar with the report, ensured that looking at novel products is now part of our regulatory framework.
So the risk categorisation of this product, is it fair to say, based on what you're saying here, you considered it was in the more low risk category?
Of this operator, it was a smaller operator which we don't attach as much time and resource to because they're in the lower risk fund.
Right.
Can I just-
Go on, please.
Can I just? I really want to go through these questions.
No, I'm sorry.
It's 10:45, and we've only got 45 minutes. So, without, because again, I don't think we've satisfactorily answered. And there's an impasse over this potential condition over liability reserves. But without that, how is it possible for a regulator to get comfortable that bets will be fair and open and be able to be paid out without new deposits, without the condition for an actual liability reserve?
So we would not be in a position to assume that level of assurance for each of our operators. So, and I think that comes back to the...
But in what context? Because this is not like any other operator.
So I think that comes back to the condition point. We wouldn't assure ourselves to that extent whereby we attach conditions in relation to each of the terms and conditions for all of our operators.
The initial funding of the company, I think, was cash investment by the owners, which covered the startup and all the initial liabilities. It's perfectly possible at that point that either it attracts the customer base and can operate, or it doesn't and it fails. The ones we see fail typically in the latter category. We don't see very many of them. £450 a second is tipping off people betting in this country. So gambling companies tend to do very, very well. This one is very different, and we wouldn't dispute that at all. Its initial capital allowed it to be able to meet its liabilities, but there is always a possibility, as Helen said earlier on, that a company could fail. We're not required, and we don't make an assessment as to whether the company will ultimately be successful. So it's possible that people can mistake and they could be meeting the liabilities, but then eventually the company cannot sustain itself. And that's why there are certain protections on what gets funded. This would be higher risk in the sense that the money is exposed for longer, but at its original size and for the first few years of operation, it was actually quite small, and it was able to cover its liabilities. I think your question, I suspect, is if it's a 3-year bet, why don't we require people to hold money to cover a whole 3 years? Which is a question I've had a lot. Actually, what they were required to do was cover their individual liabilities during that period, which they were always able to do.
During what, sorry?
During the period of the bet, which they were always able to do in live operation. And they certainly were in February 2020. As I've said in the blog afterwards, they took some very radical steps, which put the company, well, not just at risk, but took it into nosedive. Your question, I think, in terms of the original licensing, why did we not require conditions which meant they had to cover a longer term period? It's a fair question. Given the risk of the operator, it wasn't deemed at the time that was necessary, and actually through the operation of the company it was never an issue. And certainly the major financial assessment we took in February 2020, they were able to meet their liabilities. I believe if they had changed their overheads position, they would have been able to pay their liabilities for everyone and just simply stop trading. They were taking no new customers on.
So for 3 years.
But if that's the case, why didn't you then stop them trading at that point?
Or put a
I mean,
condition in that
you
they
said
had to.
publicly that you didn't think it made any difference
Right.
by waiting.
Let me explain that to you. So February, so this is one of the things that people are taking a different view on the social media, and they're making assumptions which are based on an incorrect premise. So February 2020, our in-depth financial assessment shows they had a cash holding policy of 12 months, which I've said there. They had cash to cover everything without changing anything they were doing. So in the pandemic, and this is why it was so important in the pandemic, football stopped. So obviously customers are not engaging with this. The question is, can you sustain yourself? The answer, based on the assessment, was yes. And a cash holding policy meant that they could do that. In the event of the company becoming, well, just basically ceasing to operate for some reason, they could have slashed their overheads, they had enough cash to have either just paid it out there and then, or to have carried on paying out over the 3 year period. That's based on our assessment. They're also generating enough cash through the commission on players selling to each other to cover liability, so they were able to do that up to 3 years, was our assessment. Why didn't we stop them operating? At that point, they were perfectly solvent. February 2020, they were solvent.
But they were offering a product that you knew nothing about and hadn't regulated.
No. This comes back to my earlier point. We regulated the gambling element that's defined by the Gambling Act in their original license. They included a product which we had not licensed and not given everyone and wasn't in their license application, which was the selling of shares between people, which is why a lot of people got into Football Index. So a lot of people tweet me going, I was never in it for the dividends. I believe that. The financial model of Football Index was all about the dividends. Everything else was people selling to each other and they were taking 2% skim, if you like. So why didn't we stop them at that point? Their activity is not licensable by the Gambling Commission in terms of the selling of shares, but it is not something that is therefore prohibited.
So if they had come to you originally with that model, you wouldn't have licensed them?
We wouldn't have included it in the
We
license.
wouldn't have been able
Because we
to,
couldn't have done.
because that didn't fall within our regulatory remit.
Okay, sorry, I've
Which,
got a
which,
follow-up
is,
to that.
which
You
is
carry on.
how the FCA element comes into it. Because it is a product which we felt, well, the Sheehan report details this a lot. It's a product that we felt came within the ambit of the FCA. The FCA, so I think, well, you can see the back and forth there. The FCA said yes.
Well, they
it's
agreed
licensed.
back in 2019,
Yeah, and they agreed for a long period.
but
of
then
time.
nothing happened between either of you.
Well, the
We know
FCA
why.
didn't take
We
it.
know the story there.
Yeah, we definitely, yeah.
I just wanted to ask. So it seems like, I'll be honest, you're hiding behind at licensing stage the idea that everything relies upon the size of the operator in terms of risk, but that's not the case because there is just a separate thing to do with the actual thing itself, which just applies. You know, if someone comes to you as a small operator with a blank piece of paper saying I want a license, you don't just give it to them. So I can accept your point, but for the purposes of this argument, I'd like to move that to one side and look at what is a real thing, which is there's an assessment of the product. And so within that, we talked about the liability reserve, ? But what was your understanding of the bet, of how they actually issued the bets?
So, can I just, the point you put to one side, just briefly I'd like to say, we're really not hiding behind that. We're telling you the realities of what happened in 2015. We're not hiding behind a risk-based approach. We're saying that's the reality of the work we do with the budget and the people we've got.
I appreciate that. I mean, okay, let's change the terminology. Notwithstanding that, there's still a process by which you assess a product.
Yes.
Yeah. So, what was your understanding of how they issued the bets?
So, as detailed, it was a 3-year bet.
Right, but in terms of the price point, so for example, Wayne Rooney's £2.50,
Okay.
do you understand how they issued the bets at different prices?
Yeah, we understood the fluctuations, we understood the go-to-market, and when we became
You understood
Go to
go-to-market?
market. You understood go to market?
Well, when we assessed in 2019.
Were we talking about 2015?
Yeah, just talking about the
2015,
beginning.
Okay,
Yeah.
so right at the beginning.
Yeah.
All I can say is to repeat myself.
Mm.
We looked at the product, we looked at suitability, financial security. We did not forensically examine every aspect
I know,
of the
fine.
product or the terms and conditions.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't do
Okay.
that for all of our
I'd ask you to
operations.
just, I'm not asking about any I'm just asking this is a product,
Yeah.
you're licensing it, I'm assuming you need to know how it works. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so we'd have we have.
So do you
our
know that
life-
they're only able to issue bets at all-time highs?
Pardon?
Do you know they're only able to issue bets at all-time high prices?
Yeah, we would have an assessment of the product. We had a small team looking at it post that.
But did you know that?
Did I personally know
Yeah.
that? I wasn't
Was it reported in the licensing report?
I appreciate that you've got some very detailed questions you want to ask.
Is it that detailed though?
Well,
it's just about
I
how
mean,
we
you're
issue
asking about
specs.
what individuals knew, and I know you've got a hypothesis behind it. There's a danger that with just the two of us, when we get into a level of detail, we're not be able to give you some of that.
Okay.
In terms of what was in the original license, the basic premises, we looked at the setup of the company, its viability, people behind it, and when we talk about suitability, this is to do with whether someone who's struck off as a director, social criminality, etc., barring people's opinions of others, because I get quite a bit of that thrown around. We looked at how do they issue bets. So they issue it based on the price. We know that that price can fluctuate in terms and conditions, etc. I think you're getting into a level of detail that we would probably have to pull other stuff out for to get into some of that detail. To be honest.
So how would we get to that level of detail? Would that be something we could follow up with in terms of a written correspondence to yourselves? I mean, we've only got an hour and a half today, and yes, we have gone over the detail. So is that something that FI Action can do, or would that have to
Because
go
in my
through-
view, that's not a level of detail. That's a basic understanding of the product.
Which one would agree with?
I think it's it.
Listen, I'm more than happy
Yeah.
to offer that up, and then we use our resource doing that. Is it?
I think
is
what,
it-
let's try.
I was just going to say, do you think that will help one of your, you're
I'm
saying?
just wondering how that helps you. But
Yeah.
Well, I mean, my general feeling is that you don't actually understand the
Okay.
the full product. Because that, again, that's a basic question in my view, and I know you disagree, but that's a basic
well, I
question.
think in your view, it's a basic question. I think what we're trying to set out today are the bigger pieces in terms of what happened to the company, what our general view was. I think I don't mind the fact that you're into some quite detailed questions. What might work best is, given the time we've got, or we're losing time on the same question, is if you want to submit not too long a list, because let's be reasonable, but a list of specifics that we've not addressed today, that we could look for further information. I don't mind that we'll take some deep advice, we'll consider a written response back to you.
Very quickly, would this information not have been available to Mr. Sheehan and the president?
Yeah, we
It would
released
have been.
an enormous amount of
Yeah.
information.
Okay, I'm just wondering why it
From-
wasn't.
So one of the
from
reasons the report took
2015.
longer for it to compile.
Yeah, of course. So, okay.
Could I ask, just as a general, sorry, as a regulator, are you frustrated that you don't have the resources to regulate in a way perhaps that you'd like to?
This is going to be my question about if you don't feel like the current framework can adequately uphold consumer protection, as in this case, then would that be something? I mean, obviously, the gambling review is ongoing, and the Gambling Commission will be publishing its advice, I'm sure, very soon. I hope that this case will inform some of the analysis of the limitations that you currently operate under, because I'm quite happy to, as I'm sure everyone else here is, to acknowledge that, and you've alluded to the realities of the disparity between the budget of the operators and the budget of the Gambling Commission and the resources that you have. But frankly, the gambling industry has got very, very big now. It's a massive industry. It's probably bigger than the 2005 Gambling Act could have foreseen.
It's probably
And
bigger
we
than
have-
financial services, to a
yeah.
degree,
And we
in
have-
terms of profit.
Exactly, and we have, it's bigger than McDonald's. That's the one product, Fixos Bet terminals, generate more than McDonald's in profits per year. So that's
In
it's a
this
massive-
country?
In this country, it's a massive industry. So I'm just thinking, I hope. Obviously, you have to tell us what's going to be in the advice, but I hope that's taken into account when that
So,
time
yeah,
comes.
I didn't say that I think we're not able to protect consumers.
Well, I'm sorry, Andrew, you didn't protect consumers in this, because, I mean, I understand you're operating within the framework you're given, but as a regulator, would you not feel that consumers have been let down here? Whether that's because, I'm not saying it's necessarily the Gambling Commission's fault, per se, if you're operating within what you've got, but you can't reasonably say that people haven't been let down here.
Well, so let's deal with these two issues then.
Sure.
So, as a regulator, we have to operate within the framework we've got, which Gambling Act Review recognises is not suitable for the types of products we see today. In terms of people being let down, I'll tell you exactly what I think happened in this case. You've got a very novel product. You've got sales technique, which is targeting people by making it sound like it's not gambling. It grows very rapidly, and people are taking, as these letters show, their ISAs, their house deposits, their life savings, and are convinced that either by someone else or themselves they're investing. They're not. They're gambling. They put it into this company. The basic financial premise of the company is it pays out dividends. People have gone into it making money and selling to each other. That's going to hit the ceiling where you're going to be stuck with bets that you can't sell, and maybe the dividends aren't going to pay enough, but that's the nature of it.
Well, that's the bet.
That's
the bet.
but that's the bet. What the company did was keep growing that company. We took steps around their advertising, around various other things they were doing, issues with anti-money laundering, but financially, in 2020, February, they were stable. What they then did was a series of very, very rash decisions in response to the pandemic, and they depleted the company's financial position to the point where it collapsed.
What did they communicate with you about those? Because those must have been key events. Are they not key events then?
They are key events.
They didn't
and
do
don't
anything
communicate.
as a company.
So our assessment took us to a position where we were not concerned about their financial position because we'd just gone through very detailed assessment. We've seen their cash holding policy.
Sorry,
and
just
their
right.
cash.
Nearly 11 o'clock, just a minute. Sorry.
We saw their cash position. So our concerns afterwards were about other elements. Just take a pause. So this is what we're looking at that point. Afterwards, what they did were a series of things which caused the company to collapse. They didn't notify us about their change in cash holding policy. They took advice from a third party and revised down their cash holding policy. They never discussed it with us, never told us it would have been a key event, and it would have materially changed our view of the risks that they were facing, particularly in the pandemic. It was all mentioned that this causes a significant shock within the marketplace, but they could withstand that. And actually, without making any changes, they could have withstood that and recovered afterwards. But they made a series of very, very poor decisions.
We do appreciate
and
that.
that then
They're not
caused the
blameless.
company to collapse. In terms of the question, which is sort of what he's saying, is do I think consumers have been let down by us? People will always look at the regulator and go, why didn't you prevent this happening? There's a question as to what the regulatory framework around gambling is. That's why there was always a question on this particular product as to whether it was more akin to financial services or whether it meets the financial services definition, which has different protections, different requirements, different regulatory burden, unlike gambling. The gambling regulatory framework is set up essentially to licensed bookmakers. Your point, which I appreciate, is this was far more complicated than that. It's a different kind of set of liabilities, which I would accept. That's essentially what happened to this company. The directors made decisions which caused it to
Appreciate
fail.
that.
It could have survived.
And did they inform us? No, they didn't, and that formed part of our enforcement case. Which
Doesn't help
included
you.
revocation, no.
But that's
They give us
what
a
happened.
well, yeah, okay, yeah, we understand that
What I,
directors
so
are culpable as
because we
well.
touched on initially, and again, it's an impasse over the conditioning over liability, reserve, etc. at the beginning, and there's an issue of point about risk assessment. But at that point, it's then a larger operator. Why was a condition not imposed then for reserves to be maintained? And you had a
Well, but that's what I just said to you. It did have significant reserves.
okay,
But why
so
was a
just-
condition not put in place to protect that and to protect the consumer
Yeah.
So
in February 2020? for
And
example?
also, just to be clear, you're saying that, because this is what I didn't understand, did they have, on an ongoing basis, 3 years of dividend reserve?
Because that to me in February 2020 would require £36 million
no,
of cash.
they weren't holding 3 years worth of cash. No.
So how would
Not as in separate. So they had enough cash to be able to change nothing. And so your question is essentially, did they have a separate, in effect, escrow account sitting there with 3 years of the liability? No, they didn't.
But they didn't have that in the general trading account either.
No,
£36
they
million.
didn't have. They didn't need to. Under their liabilities, they need to meet their ongoing liabilities to the dividends. And this is my point. And this is where we
But-
probably disagree in terms of.
But you said they could have closed down in February 2020 and just paid the dividends out. Now, the dividend liability at that time was £1 million per month. So when I read the Sheehan report which confirmed that, I thought, wow, they had £36 million. That is my thought process. What you're now saying, whether that was in an escrow account or in the trading account, but that doesn't sound like the case. They couldn't have paid everyone out the dividends that were owed because it was accruing at £1 million a month.
Yeah. So let me explain that. So what they could have done. So this is based on our assessment of February 2020. So they had their cash holding policy was more than sufficient to pay their liabilities.
Can you just clarify, what do you mean? Do you mean to pay the dividends over the 3 years?
So they're ongoing. Your question is, were they holding 3 years worth of cash?
Yeah.
My answer to that is
So when you
no.
say liabilities, the cash on
I mean they're running liabilities.
I think that's an operation.
That's an operation.
Right.
They were able to
Does that
pay
include the
more.
dividends or
Yes,
not?
yes, it includes the dividends.
For how long?
So this is what I've said already. So they, without making any changes to their operation at all, could pay their dividends for a full year.
Right,
So,
sure.
so they could have absorbed no customers.
Yeah, okay.
They could carry on marketing at the same rates, paying directors at the same rate, doing everything the same rate, and they could have survived for a year with no change.
So we're saying they had
It
12
must
million.
be like
So-
14 to 15 million.
So what they were then, so the reason I've said they could have paid dividends for 3 years is if you get to the point where you go, I don't know, there's a pandemic, football stop, the company goes, we can't operate anymore, bring the shutters down, they stop spending the weekends, they stop paying people, they stop paying towards different things. And this obviously this is a theoretical assessment because you're taking, well, if you dropped all of those figures, you've got this cash, you could potentially then pay everything over 3 years. And that's what they were able to do.
If there's no
And
trading
some-
or minting of new shares, they wouldn't have been able to without £36 million.
So
It's basic
I'm
maths.
telling you, right, so I'm not the forensic accountant, I'm telling you
It's basic
what the
maths.
review
It's basic
says
maths. You'll only need to be a
is
forensic accountant
they
for this.
were able to meet those liabilities, and they certainly in their cash holding were able to meet their liabilities for a full 12 months without absorbing any new customers. All bookmakers to a certain degree have to bring in customers in
Yeah.
order to keep
They're not
all
bookmakers.
businesses,
Yeah.
all businesses will need new business to keep going eventually because they've got outgoing liabilities. This is why they couldn't float on NASDAQ.
But you've just said, with the greatest respect, you've just said that if they basically slashed their costs, they could pay dividends at that rate for 3 years.
Is what
So,
is
I mean, as David mentions, the dividends being paid out at that time were £1 million a month. So, I mean, it's very simple to say that if you're saying they could pay dividends for 3 years, they must have had £36 million
No, they didn't. That's
available
the
to
point.
do that.
They didn't.
No, but that's what, with the greatest
To be
respect,
honest.
that's what you're saying.
Well, only basically by shutting down or
But then there'd be no
costs.
No,
trading.
but
There'd
there's
be no
still,
trading in
still-
any
yeah.
shares.
there's still £36 million
No, I agree.
in that business in February 20, is what you're saying.
No.
Exactly.
And actually, they were burning £3 million a month, so they could have spent 36 million
Yeah, what-
when
what-
I looked at the
what-
report,
yeah.
but clearly they weren't.
Yeah,
I mean-
what I'm trying to explain is,
I think this is what's not clear.
yeah, but what I'm trying to explain is the solvency of the company in February 20. So the
Which I
question
appreciate isn't your major concern. I
The
appreciate that.
question that I get quite a lot is, well, why didn't you stop them operating in 2019? Well, because there wasn't a good reason to. They had some compliance issues, but they weren't of the severity to stop them operating. So, and also, people are going, well, you knew they were in financial trouble. Actually, no. And in February 2020, they absolutely weren't in financial trouble. When we knew they were in severe financial trouble was February 2021.
Yeah.
So when people get angry at me going, oh, it made no difference, I'm not being dismissive about it. The point when we knew they were not solvent was immediately before that time.
They're only getting angry at you because you're the face. It's not.
I get it, I get it.
Yeah, you
No, but I
weren't
think-
here.
no, but I
yeah.
think also
Can I just ask-
there's some frustration there because in that year, you talk about the fact that they've made these increases in dividends and so on, which has but essentially what they've done in that year is create a Ponzi. They have created a situation where new money has come in, and there have been a lot of money invested between February 20 and February 21. I personally, all of the money that I put in was during that period. And during that period, they were saying we've never been in stronger financial health. Everything is fine. We're regulated by the Gambling Commission. All of these things that, no, I'm sure, but as a consumer, I have some basic expectations around what is reasonable for a product that I'm putting money into. And
It's
They-
protected. We
they
live in
reflect-
a consumer protected environment, from buying a car to buying an ISA to the food we buy from McDonald's. And when a gambling company is allowed to take £124 million worth of open bets, so it's high at one stage, I believe, I would expect that protection to be close to making sure that I wasn't betting on the survival of the company. I was betting on my players performing well on the pitch.
Yeah, no, I
or
get
scoring
that.
well,
I totally get it.
So maybe my perception is out of kilter with what you're able to
I think
do.
this is one of the really big difficulties for us, is as a consumer, you imagine all consumer protection, regulatory protection being very similar. So as it was, I used to run food regulation, and it is far more onerous and specific, and there's a constant audit regime. There's also different market forces that don't exist in gambling. Financial services, of course, there's a compensation scheme which is not absolute, but the regulation is totally different. One of the reasons we've got the Gambling Act is gambling is regulated as a leisure activity. When you read the Sheehan report, one of the things that I found really upsetting, lots of things that I found upsetting, one of the things that really bothered me when I read it. Sorry?
Feelings mutual.
I'm sure it is. But it's probably a slightly different aspect to it. But the thing I found really upsetting is when we're talking to the FCA about people taking money out of their ISAs, and it's in the letters as well,
We've seen
and putting it into this, given my knowledge of what the regulatory framework is, the risks there are massive. You're right, you're not betting on the survival of the company. But when that's why gambling is totally unsuited to that kind of money, because there isn't that protection framework.
Yeah.
Where we get a lot of grief, and I think we will, if we haven't done already, revise the wording around the levels of protection, is people assume it means more than it does. Protections around gambling are very slight compared to other things.
And I'll hold my hand up. I worked for two major banks for nearly 30 years, and for me, I didn't look into it myself in terms of what those protection levels here when operate a high protection. I didn't look into that myself. So I'll take a bit of blame for that, I will.
But had you done that, it wouldn't have protected the whole of the portfolio.
Maybe I wouldn't put that much money in,
It
to be
would be
fair.
But that is also one of the things that I touched on the blog, but I'll say a little bit more about. When we did the financial assessment in February 2020, one of our major concerns was the lack of cover for the portfolio. So to your sort of broader point where, I'm saying, look, for the next year they could cover the liabilities. That doesn't mean that they're holding at that point in time enough cash so that if the lights literally went out and they want to pay the whole 3 years there and then, they absolutely could have done that. I'm not sure they could have done. But one of the things that our team raised when we did the assessment they were concerned about is there was no insurance in place for the portfolio. Now, actually under the regulations, they're not obliged to have that in place. And it's difficult, in fact, we took advice on it at the time, it's difficult, if not impossible, for us to set a condition on something that we don't regulate. So because there are elements of this that we do not regulate and cannot regulate, we can't therefore set conditions on it. So we can set conditions on things which come out of the Gambling Act, but not on things which sit outside it, which is why, I know people sort of go, oh, well, you've regulated a Ponzi scheme, then you've tried to get the FCA to bail you out. Actually, the conversation with the FCA was about the fact that we've got effectively a financial market that's been created. There is no insurance or protection on it. It doesn't fit our regulations. We think it fits yours. We've seen their first answer was, we do as well. And that was our concern, is how do you secure protection?
Why didn't you
for
follow
that?
that up then? Why was it
We
never
did.
followed up?
We did.
What, I mean, with
We
the greatest
did.
respect, you had this conversation in 2019.
No. We
No, not in
absolutely.
To be fair, I'll
from
say-
the middle of 2019.
Oh, yeah, I'm talking about insurance.
I beg your pardon. All the way through, we followed the conversation up. We couldn't compel either Vet Index to get a license. or
No, I'm talking in the
or-
conversation between yourselves and the FCA.
Yeah, no,
That's what
I
I'm talking about.
yeah. I mean, I think it took longer, but
all,
yeah.
all along,
Question.
we continued the conversation. We couldn't
It's
compel.
documented in the report. I think.
Yeah, and that's one of
Yeah,
his criticisms.
yeah.
And that's one of his criticisms.
That would be a
Fair.
conversation for the FCA, I think, if that was ever done.
we
It's not your
thought
fault.
Well, I know, but look, we've got a team of dedicated people working hard on this. We've got our constraints.
Yeah.
That's why I'm really keen to point out, I'm not trying to hide behind anything. We have various constraints which, yes, we'd like to address by the Gambling Act. Small regulators, small budgets.
Can I ask you a quick question on that?
But we absolutely continued that
you've got
conversation
one.
because that part of the product, there was agreement from both ourselves and the FCA that they had remit, and that agreement continued post suspension. And whilst we couldn't compel either Vet Index to apply nor the FCA to compel a licence, we were conscious of the fact that they have the FCA, the compensation fund, although a licence doesn't automatically guarantee access to the fund. We were aware of that.
Do you feel let down by the FCA? Do you feel that they kind of left you hanging a bit?
We're never going to answer that question.
Can I ask?
You don't blame me for asking, though. Go on, anyway.
Look, I think, we've got to a position, the FCA are in a difficult position where they've got about 40,000 products on the perimeter, which are new and novel products, which are things that they don't currently regulate. And as it says in the report, they have taken a policy view on what they do and don't do, and that's not been tested by the courts. So that's all I would say. I mean, the FCA would acknowledge they took far too long to give us an answer. They didn't actually give us an answer until 2 months after the collapse of the company.
What was that answer?
And the answer was they don't think it's for them. Actually, their QC's advice was they think there's an error in the original case law, and therefore
See, I didn't know that, so thank you for clarifying.
doesn't come to them. It's in the report.
I think it's in
It's in the report.
sheet and
Is
It's in the
report.
sheet. But it's, there's nothing that we wouldn't say in answer to a parliamentary question if it was very lucky.
Did they define the product? Sorry, it's such a legal question. Did they define what the product was? Did the QC for the FCA or your legal advice actually define what this product was? It's not a bet, is it? Because it can be tradable. And Bet Index's own wording was our business model was the mechanism for turning a fixed odds bet into a tradable instrument. As soon as I read that, I thought, well, that's out of your scope in 2019. So, what was the definition of what we were buying?
So
It wasn't a bet, was it? It wasn't a fixed odds bet. So, have you had legal advice as to what the definition of that product is? That share in that player.
yeah, so the legal advice is around the legislation and the remit rather than definition of the product. It's
So the
more
FCA
about
wouldn't have had
remit.
that either, then. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Oh, so the FCA didn't share what their QC said because their QC has said it doesn't fit their regulatory
Oh yeah,
model.
yeah.
So they must have defined the product to make that decision, surely. It's not a bet, so it's not a gamble.
So
Yeah.
there will be a definition. I can't remember what it was. But
Would I be able to have that information shared with me if I drop you an
No,
email?
because it
I
wasn't
wouldn't-
the legal privilege.
No, it'd be
because
privileged,
it's-
so
because it's
no.
part of their
Um,
QC advice.
Yeah,
Okay, that's fine. Thank
because
you.
we have in public bodies you can have shared privilege on specific items. So they share privilege on that one. I think we did the same in our QC's advice. But essentially, the optical bit is the FCA made a policy decision and then they took legal advice which supported it. That's not been tested by the courts. I mean, I'm not saying that as a loaded statement. understand.
No, it hasn't been. No, I appreciate that.
And, you know, we've got a number of products where there are different interpretations of whether it's in or out of our regulation, but that doesn't mean another regulator will therefore adopt it.
Mm.
And this is to my earlier point, which I know is a bit odd, but there are things which are not regulated by anyone, and everybody's got an opinion on who they should be regulated by. A bit like when drones first came around. They just weren't covered by regulation, and then somebody needed to make some. We've got an increasing number of products, of which Popular Index was a very big one, but there are multiples other that have tailored themselves to try and avoid coming under regulation as well.
That's so rare.
Which are so rare as an interesting debate that we won't have, but yes. But there are others out there, there's a whole list of them, who market themselves on not being regulated by, because they think, I don't know why they think it's a selling point, I think it's a bit silly, but they exist in that area where...
That's risk versus reward. You get a high
Can we
reward.
ask some more questions if we've only got 10 minutes?
Yeah, of course,
yeah. I know you've got other ones.
I don't understand, because you've said very clearly this product was all about the dividends, and we've unsatisfactorily addressed the point at the beginning as to assuring...
You keep telling me that, but I got it, don't worry.
Why didn't you then, when you did this assessment, understanding the dividends were central to it, and knowing that they only had a year's worth, then still impose a condition on them?
Okay, I mean, I think the assessment at the time was their cash holding policy and cash payout policy was enough to be able to do nothing but pay their dividends and change nothing else. Because if they changed, well, that was if they changed nothing at all. In the event of distress, they could have made other changes, which they did later do, but they did them at the wrong time and the wrong way. And they could have actually met their liabilities for an awful lot longer. What we did at that point, which is central to the point, is our concern was that essentially what they were holding cash, the main exposure is in the whole portfolio size, which is why I mentioned the insurance point. That was our concern, is that they didn't have a mechanism to fall back on financially in the event of an immediate, let's say, to pay everything there.
So surely.
But that was on something which is not covered
And
by
could that
the
have been a
regulation.
condition? Where you-
So our ability to impose conditions is wide. We'd need something to hand it on.
It would need to be something under our regulations.
Yeah, within our regulations.
Oh, I see, the portfolio.
So we couldn't just have a concern and a risk and impose a condition. We'd have to have something to hand it on. We were undertaking compliance with your quota in a number of areas, but whilst we'd look at finances, and we did, we're not that kind of economic regulator that will examine the finances and financial stability of all of those operators within our remit.
I appreciate
We don't
that.
have that.
I think
I think your question is, in a sense, what's this round your question is, had we imposed a condition in 2020 to have insurance,
I'm not all about the insurance point. You can talk anything else.
or a condition
It's
that they
about-
had to have that cash holding?
Well,
Cash
and
out.
basically to lock down the contract, so not to change the terms and conditions again. I'd expect to be fair, which would be that they could have then materially changed, but they did. Basically to
And
lock
those were
down.
the terms and conditions.
Yeah.
But by that point, they've introduced the terms and conditions, which was contradictory to the whole basis of a fixed odds bet.
So it's all kind of interlinked. I guess that's the difficulty.
Well, I mean, again, if you're looking at terms and conditions saying they're reserving the right to change the dividends, which effectively is the odds on the bet.
We're basically in no man's land
Yeah.
at the risk of everything because no one's done
Well,
it.
that was one of the issues with instant sell, is there's an algorithm behind it that it would, if everybody started selling, it would keep the price down to zero in order to protect financial position. So there are a number of things in there.
But that's all right as long as the dividend, because I think everyone believed that the dividend payments were what they were. But that was a market can't be established without a reliable dividend stream. That's what we were trading.
This is the point. The portfolio values are almost arbitrary.
They're a derivative.
The portfolio values are essentially a second-hand valuation. It's a second-hand price for the bets that you've made.
Yeah. So that 2015 is central to everything that happened afterwards, because that's what the market was built on. It doesn't matter if you can call it a portfolio, but it's the reliability of the dividends.
Yeah, I
Which
think
were
we're-
not capped at 3 years either, which was the
I
main
think we're
thing.
probably talking about the same thing in terms of the dividend. I'm talking about its portfolio, but I'm talking about really what is the whole liability of the life of that bet.
Yeah. So I mean, for example, one of the things I found odd when I was looking into all this is there doesn't seem to be any sort of regulation about how funds that are bet are treated. So if you've got a Bet365, William Hill, whoever, if I have 100 quid on something to win, whatever, where that money is bet, and whilst that bet is open, that money that has been used for that bet doesn't seem to have any kind of regulatory home.
Well, this is important, I want to add on, and this is an important point, I think, in just looking at this as a product compared to other products, regardless of the size of the operator, is I assume if an operator goes under, like a bookie, when there's a match in place, the funds that are staked are at risk. But if they're in cash deposits, depending on the protection, they're potentially protected. That makes sense when events are an hour and a half long.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense when a bet is 3 years long. And so again, I don't see the proportionate application of just a basic assessment compared to other operators, that if the bet goes under after 1 year, 2 years and 11 months, it's totally different than any other casino horse race, like every single other type of, and that's again a question, who thought about that, or did anyone think about that?
And just sorry, as an final point.
I'd like an answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just as an add-on though, if a bet is voided in a conventional bookmaker, you expect that stake to be repaid to the consumer. So what is your expectation, on top of what was just asked, what is your expectation about where those funds should sit with an operator?
I'm sure I haven't answered this, but the basic premise of it is, regardless of the level of protection. So somebody might say, well, we've got medium protection, others say high. It doesn't mean they only behave in a certain way. So somebody with medium might do a lot more than is required. Typically what happens, if I call it a standard bookmaker, once you place your bet, that's typically effectively held in a trust, isn't it?
If it's
The
high
funds.
protection.
If it's high protection, it's held in a trust.
Well, medium protections.
Well,
Oh,
medium
trust
protection, cash
account.
balances, it goes at risk. What a lot of operators do is they've got enough, because of the shorter distance of bets, they've got enough cash on hand to cover it anyway. What they tend to do is effectively ring fence that money, which is how they're able to return a voided bet. Bearing in mind they've got a lot more markets, lots of different sports, and their cash flow is a completely different thing. That's essentially what they do. High protection, of which there are some operators that do that. Anything you stake is covered by trust. National Lottery works in the same way. All your ticket money is held in a
But
trust.
what happens with medium protection?
So it varies, isn't it?
Yeah, but we
I think
don't
it's
mandate protection either, so you'd have to.
No, I understand, but an operator states that they have a certain level of protection, and then in order to have that, they have to demonstrate that they have a trust fund, for example, for cash balances.
Medium protection, they have evidence that they've got a trust account, cash balance.
So,
Which
do
is
you,
what we have.
But this
are
is-
open bets? I mean, so if I have my £100 with William Hill,
It's stakes. But if
so
they get-
so what are staked bets? What is their status?
So, yeah, so it's.
At risk, yeah.
It's a risk
So
funds, yeah.
just to clarify, so at licensing, you knew that this product was different in that funds are at risk when staked, but these were going to be at risk for a significant period of time, and therefore a question should have arisen. Do you not think a question should have arisen over the protection, not just in terms of the medium, low, high, but back to the dividend liability reserve? That's what I'm asking, because you knew that they were at risk for a significant period of time. So where was the approach to that? Thinking approach.
So that's your same point, and we should have had a condition around compelling additional protections for the additional length of time of the bet.
Yeah, so in light of that, do you think there should have been a better approach to that? The sensitivity of people's funds at risk for so long, given that they're not really protected. And you know that because you know what the levels of customer protection are.
Yeah. So, at the risk of repeating myself, would we have done that? With hindsight, we might well have done in 2015. But would we look forensically at all of those, at the finances of the business to that extent, where we would then attach conditions in relation to the finances? It's unlikely we would have done that. We're not that type of economic regulator.
If you could,
So,
ignoring the framework, if you could regulate gambling firms as you would want, would you? And you had, let's say, you had unlimited resources.
Yeah.
Would you feel that that is something that you should do?
It's in a sense that doesn't matter what we think of that. It
Well, no,
depends on
I mean,
the
it does matter.
Come on, we've only got a
Well,
few
no,
minutes.
No, it doesn't, because it depends on the framework we're given. As a regulator, we don't get to reinterpret that. So then you're basically taking us into, do you think that gambling should be regulated more like financial services? And that's not, that takes us into a different kind of territory.
I think it's more the fact that as a statutory advisor to DCMS, are you in this gambling review process? Are you going to, you are the ones at the front line, and you more than anyone know like what your limitations are and whether you can you can adequately exercise oversight of these operators in this sector now. Are you going to explain that to DCMS? So, is that going to be part of your advice? Like, I think that's really important because I think your opinion does matter. You're the advisor to DCMS. You're not just part of DCMS. I think
My point is we can't entirely freestyle it in terms of what we think should happen. It's more complicated than that. Our advice to DCMS will cover things like the funding mechanism for the Gambling Commission. Not just we need more money, it's more because of the type of regulatory approach we think we need to take based on the risks that we see today versus the risks that we see when the 2005 Act was drafted, which would be before 2005. So our advice will cover things like that. It's unlikely to go as far as to say we think gambling should be regulated by financial services, because that's not a policy question we've been asked. The policy question we've been asked is what changes do we think there needs to be to the 2005 Act in line with the principles of gambling being a leisure activity. People will always debate that. But in terms of what we are very likely to say around what we think we need for the future, that would take us much more into a lot more testing, monitoring, assessment. Not that we don't do a lot of it now, but we don't have the ability to have a constant, Helen's point was we do lots of proactive work, but what we don't do is go, company X, we just go and see them on CV.
But I think
there are some.
That's the sort of thing.
There are some gambling regulators who operate in that way. From Nevada, for example, with the machines. I think
Nevada's a very different thing.
Of course, but still, the gambling industry in Britain, the remote sector is the biggest regulated sector in the world. Right? So there's no reason why the regulator shouldn't have that degree of oversight in theory, and there's no reason why those resources couldn't be provided if the license fees were set.
That's an obvious point. And they're not set at that level.
A lot of the messaging I'm getting, rightly or wrongly, is that you're saying to us, we might have done things differently if we had the resource to do it. We might have done more of a forensic accounting. We might have looked into more detail. We might have been more proactive. You're saying they're low risk because at the time they were a small firm. Would you categorise? Should you be categorising risk of a product around the size of the firm offering it? Bearing in mind, you can't. You're then saying to us, we don't have the resource to manage that firm down the line.
Let me respond to that point. So, what we have said since the collapse of the Bet Index, in line with the Sheehan report, we do not solely now, not that we solely have, but we do not assess companies only on GGY. We pay far more attention to novel products. We haven't had ones lately. But more novel products of things which we think present a different level of risk beyond GGY. And that is something that we think should have been part of our approach before. Would it have changed the outcome here, I think is debatable. Because this is my point where we can talk about what did we think about at the time, etc. The company in the end collapsed because of the actions of its directors. That's why it collapsed.
Right, but that's enabled by the framework they're operating.
And that's your point, right? But what I'm saying here is now we have a different approach to novel products. I think it's a matter of debate, would that change the outcome? We're not saying that it solely comes down to resources, but the resources and the framework dictates what effort we can put into each case.
It would have had a different.
It
would have had a different impact on you because you wouldn't have put your money in.
You've still got the same framework now as you had before. So you're saying you are taking a more active approach from a risk point of view and looking at novel products. So clearly you could have within the framework done that before.
Today too, as before.
Your operator fees are.
So the operator's fees are up. That gives us more resource, but our assessment process with novel products is.
So that was one of the recommendations of the report, which we absolutely.
One of the things that we did as soon as I joined is we went through all the road licences, looking for anything that had innovated in marine time or is not declared to us. And what we've got are some operators that there's nothing in the licence market that was significant, is there? But there are others which we believe are unlicensed and possibly should.
And that's incredibly encouraging. But obviously, you know, if it had been, if you could apply that retrospectively, if you had been doing that previously,
I think
what
that
the outcome would be?
what we've got to be careful is to make assumptions about what we would have then done.
It's a question mark though.
It's
No, I
a question.
understand.
It's a question. Obviously, it's a question mark. With hindsight, there's always a question mark as to what would, especially given what we know now. And given, you know, it's very hard to sort of imagine that you'd say, well, we wouldn't have done anything differently. Knowing what we know now, of course we would have. But
What
given
would you have
what
done
we knew
differently?
then, well, given what we know now, we're talking about, well, would it be better if we put conditions in? But of course, we didn't know what they were about to do with the company.
That's why you put conditions in, is it to protect yourself as a regulator
But
and
it's
consumers?
whether or not A, we could have done in terms of things which are not within our regulatory remit. So it's not like we didn't
So
think about things.
could you not put a condition in that they needed to have expenses for 3 years because you revoked Contagious Sports licence because they couldn't prove to you they held 3 years worth of...
Can you say that again?
You revoked Contagious Sports licence for not proving to you they had 3 years of costs. So you could have added that as a condition, surely.
So I'd have to look at that.
I'm happy to send it to
Yeah.
you if you've got the details. But yeah, again,
Well,
there are
if you
precedents.
we'll find them, but
There are precedents before the collapse of the football index, which I feel could have protected us better. And I'm taking that from your own website. So again, that's my frustration. We can talk about the licensing from day one, but we can also talk about the warning signs for the 5 years afterwards. And my main frustration is that it was kind of like we had this information belatedly, and we still didn't protect the consumers and your own licensing framework as well, because I'm sure you don't want all the abuse you're getting on Twitter and everything else, not personally, but in terms of the Gambling Commission as well. I know you do, which is unacceptable. So that's my frustration, but I'm happy to take that offline. If you want to give me a card, I won't bombard you, I can just send you a couple of points that we may not cover off today.
Yeah, just because I think we're out. I think
Yeah.
you want to say a couple of finishing things, but just one thing, non-contentious. Your internal investigation, is that finished now?
This is the
So the license review or our lessons learned?
Well, I understood you were conducting an internal investigation into betting.
So there are two things. I think people confuse that and the use of wrong terminology. Two things. One was the review of the licence and the personal management licences, which is complete. We also commissioned a lessons learned report with an external. It came up with very similar conclusions to the Sheehan report.
So what I was referring to is probably the review into the license
License.
The
review.
license
Yeah,
review.
so well,
So the operating license review.
Was that the one that started a year and a half ago?
Yes.
Right, okay. So there was no separate investigation. I thought for some reason there was a separate investigation. That was not the case.
So we would undertake an internal lessons learned,
Yeah, okay.
and included in that would be,
Okay.
as it has been, incorporating the Sheehan recommendations, ensuring we're
And are they
Sweet,
internal only documents, or will they be shared at all
no,
with
they're internal.
internal?
Do you, what?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, firstly, thank you.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Yeah, thank
we
you.
really appreciate the time, and we also appreciate you weren't here when all this happened, so it's difficult. We also, don't have first-hand experience of what happened at the time. We do appreciate that under the existing framework, there isn't a mechanism for redress for consumers. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, one of the things that we're exploring is whether or not we can talk to MPs and try and get some sort of political pressure in place to try and get the government to consider that. Now, I mean, given what's happened, and obviously absolutely understanding what you said today, is that something that you would be sympathetic towards and supportive of if we were to able to get the government to consider putting some kind of redress in place as a result of what's happened? Is that something that you can consider?
it's not something that we will comment on. So
Well, sorry, what my question or the wider point? Sorry.
So on the wider point of redress, we've set out why there's nothing we can implement it. If you want to campaign elsewhere and talk to MPs, etc., I would genuinely regard that as a matter for you. It's not something that we would. So, for example, we wouldn't take up opposition to it because we would literally say it's just not a role for us.
So you'd be neutral. You'd be neutral.
Yeah,
And-
we'd
yeah,
be
which is fair
neutral.
enough. Yeah.
That's why I say I wouldn't comment on it. It's because legally we don't have a role in it. It's an administration. It's a company's going into administration. I know people will argue as to why it ended up that way, but it's a company into administration. Governments typically don't give anything towards that. So if it's something that you want to argue for, something that we wouldn't say we think that's wrong, we wouldn't say we think that's right. We'd say, well,
It's
we
none of
just
your
don't
business,
have a
really,
role
isn't
in
it?
it.
Yeah.
Well, I think just in relation to that, I mean, obviously the Sheehan report talked about the regulatory framework and how it was applied in this case, both with yourself and the FCA and so on. I think, you know, you are an interested party in this. I mean, you're involved. So having, you know, no one is suggesting that you sort of do some mea culpa and say, you know, you're right, we're to blame. No one's suggesting that. You know, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, though, is a situation where everyone recognises the regulatory shortcomings that you're operating under. You know, whether it be resource, the legal framework of the Gambling Act and so on. But the question is really recognising that you did what you could within that framework. Could you not see that if you were able to do more in hindsight, you've already talked about the fact you're changing your risk assessment of more novel products, is that not an argument for then saying, well look, yes, we could say, well look, we can see why people were or feel that they weren't given, you know, enough regulatory protection during that period, and we can support that we need to have more regulation in this area.
I think, well, that's different.
Well, no,
Yeah.
right, but
I think we're just.
But I think you can say that people weren't given enough regulatory protection by the FCA and yourself during that period. I think you can reasonably say that off the back of the Sheehan report, can't you?
Well, that's not what the report says.
Well, it says
It's in the report. I mean, I don't think we can ask Andrew's personal opinion
Yeah,
based
I
on
think
what's in the
so.
report. I think I've got a couple of things I just want to touch base on, but
Yeah,
I think
we are going to have to wrap.
yeah, of course you are. Yeah,
So,
sorry.
on the point of seeking redress, the Gambling Commission specifically does not have redress in its remit. It's excluded. This is one of the debates around the Gambling Act review and the creation of an ombudsman, which wouldn't pay redress, but it would direct it. It wouldn't particularly help you in this case because it would direct redress from an operator, and the operator's insolvent. So,
well, not necessarily, but again,
But-
that's a big
that's
point.
different-
Let's not
different
get
issue.
to the yeah.
so we don't get into the discussion about redress. It's specifically not in our remit. So we wouldn't comment on it. We certainly wouldn't say we think you lacked regulatory protection, because that's not what we see the report saying. The report does have lessons and does have some questions, but it doesn't go to the point of saying this is, you know, you lost your money in the company collapse because of the regulator, or the regulator could have prevented the collapse. It doesn't say those things. It talks about the issues between us and the FCA. It says it took too long, we should pay more attention to other products. Had we intervened earlier, it might have made a difference. However, it depends on whether we could do it. That's always going to be a matter of debate. On the issue of redress, in terms of what you want to do on that data, we would simply be neutral. I'm not in opposition to asking, but I don't think. I think
You're not campaigning against us, are you? Exactly. And it's the same as Lee Day last week. We're neutral with regards to the appointment of liquidators and administrators because it wasn't their area to comment on.
You know, it's the sort of
I
thing
get that.
it's a matter for you, not something that we would give a view on. You're right, we're an interested party. We're an interested party in lots of things. I think we're interested, but we're not. We don't have a role in it because our remit doesn't give us that role. If we had a role on redress or we were administering compensations, we'd be having a different kind of conversation.
Which
We don't.
which we understand.
So it's the sort of thing we simply would not comment on. So it's not, as I say, it's not taking up oppositions, which is why when people ask about it, generally, I tend to either not talk about it because people don't tend to understand the remit point, or they assume that, as some have done, well, it's not Andy Rose's choice, so we don't get any. No, you're right, it isn't. I don't have a choice in either direction. I don't have a role in it. So we simply wouldn't wouldn't be involved.
I understand.
It'd be a matter, essentially it'd be a matter for Treasury.
Can I just give you the figures on the settlement fines?
Sure.
Oh yes, please. Yeah, and I've got something else quickly. Yeah, go on.
So,
This was the 102 million, wasn't it, since 1718? Thank you.
well, sorry, I've only got the current years today,
Okay.
but I can give a better break, the wider breakdown.
I mean, for 21. Yeah.
Yeah. So regulatory settlements were just over 2.7 million, and fines nearly 16.5 million.
16.
But that's just this year.
So it is more fines and settlements. So thank
Well, it
you.
was this year.
Okay. Yeah.
I think generally though, we'll probably see it go in that direction. Mainly because the one we have a slightly different stance in terms of where we've got to the board and operators. What we're typically seeing is more operators that are not on their first offence.
Yeah.
So regulatory settlements go out the window then. If
So you can
it's-
actually almost forecast what you're seeing
So,
based on.
Well, you can't forecast, but the split I would expect to increasingly move towards fines
Fine.
and less on the regulatory settlement this year. And the Gambling Act, I'm sure we'll touch on the role of regulatory settlements.
And
One last question, which was I've had it for ages. When we were talking about the response to the pandemic, you mentioned something, and I'm afraid I think you got interrupted. You said this is why something, and then NASDAQ. It almost sounded like you knew something about BetIndex relationship with NASDAQ. Are you about to tell us
I only
something?
know everything that I've been told, so it may be inaccurate. It's got nothing to do with the pandemic.
No, it was just when you mentioned it. That was all just for your own memory, sort of thing.
So my understanding of the issue that they had around NASDAQ, and I've got this from a third party, so I don't know how
I
likely
won't hold
it
you
is.
to it, don't I?
Sorry?
I won't hold you to it. Don't worry. But it'd be interesting to know.
So my understanding is the issue they had is to do with negative cash flow, basically. So at any given time, the company might be solvent and have money to pay liabilities out, but in the next financial year, it may not be able to demonstrate that it has incoming cash flow.
Right.
So it could demonstrate negative cash flow, which I'm pretty sure is something that caused an issue with being listed on NASDAQ, which is, I think, why they ended up not doing it, is what I was told. But it's to do with the general business model.
I just
You're
want to
gonna
follow
take
up
that
on.
short,
Okay. Thank you.
No. I was just going to follow up on that, and just then this final comment from me. But so, did your forensic accountant identify that they were only reporting income in year one of the 3-year term, and therefore couldn't cover that?
No. This is in relation to something else. I don't know. I don't think that's what you would call it. I don't know specifically on
Okay.
how you treated that.
Okay, that's just back to an important point, because if they were only recording income in year one and not portioning over 3 years, then inherently you would need new deposits to cover liabilities.
Oh right, okay. So no. That's I'm pretty sure when we did the assessment in 2020.
It's the forensic accountant.
Yeah, that's not what it looked like. My point about NASDAQ is in relation to how NASDAQ
Yeah.
treats your accounts and what it allows and
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
allow.
Well, NASDAQ
So
obviously
it's
put their
got
name to it. Yeah.
it's got nothing to do with it's got nothing to do. It's got very little to do with your how solvent you
Yeah.
are. This to do
Yeah.
with what accounting.
I
treatment.
understand it
That's
from
fine.
discounted
The
cash
accountant
flow
didn't
basis.
identify that they were accounting in that way. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm
Because
just
that was
completely
suggested
it's
by
completely
further
separate.
material. But
It's
that's
a completely separate point that I know people
Was
ask.
that informed part of our
Yeah,
investigation?
no, I don't think it
That's
did. It's the point I was making really is people sort of go, well, what happened with the NASDAQ thing? And I think it's because they couldn't meet the requirements of NASDAQ.
Okay. That's interesting. I didn't know that. So thank you for that.
Is what I've been told. Let's
Yeah.
say-
That's fine. Yeah.
I'm sorry for repeating,
Okay.
but just for absolute clarity, because are you saying that forensic accountant did not identify, or he was not of the opinion that they were recording their income only in year one and not apportioning it over the life of the term so that they could meet their liabilities? It's a separate point to NASDAQ, I'm just saying. Is that what are you saying that he did identify that, didn't identify that, or were they deferring their income to meet their liabilities? Because in the absence of deferring it, you then have to take in new customer deposits to meet liabilities.
I don't know.
It's fine if
exactly.
you don't know.
Yeah, I don't know exactly
Okay,
how we
fine.
looked at that. I mean, I get your question. It's a
Yeah.
simple question.
We'll just say we don't know. It's fine.
Yeah, no, I don't know exactly.
I just wanted to, because the last thing, I just want to say thank you, because we'll obviously go away from next steps. We'll talk about that. I mean, from my view, tell me if you disagree. I personally feel like this happened, the review's taking place. It's only had input from 2 bodies, obviously, and there's a description of events. I feel like there are lots of questions which obviously we don't have time to answer today, which for me raise even more questions about how things were done within the existing framework, notwithstanding there were aspects of the product that developed that were then unregulated, but way back to the beginning, which I think deserves serious consideration. Unfortunately, we can't take it up here, but to be brutally honest, I'm of absolute determination that somehow, I don't know how, maybe it's through government or select committee, that we actually get to the real truth and have the debates which you mentioned, which are question marks about, we can't determine here that we need evidence and potential people to speak. But yeah, there are many, many more questions that I'm not satisfied about in terms of.
And we're not going away. I mean, we may not
Yeah.
even see you again, and thank you for
But
your
notwithstanding
time,
that,
but we are
thank
not
you
going
for the
away.
time. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you for the time.
But also, just for your own
David, sorry,
information,
can I just ask Matt a final thing as well?
just in terms of the top 50, you mentioned the GGY, it is in the report, and the Commission noted that Football Index was quickly approaching top 10 of GGY. So I just thought I'd let you know that, because just for your own information, now that's in the report.
Sorry, I just have one final question that we haven't touched on in any way. Did you at any stage look into the outflow of money from BetIndex to Index Labs? And how that might have
Yeah, I
impacted?
think you said in 2020 there was no indication they were paying. Well, you said they weren't paying dividends. I don't know if you said they weren't.
Yeah, we did look at the flows between them.
So when you looked at their liabilities, were you taking a liability to Index Labs of whatever they were paying them, like £8 million, £9 million a year?
So that formed part of the BetIndex liabilities.
Yeah, I'm sure the answer is no.
Yeah.
None of these, the licensing application, the forensic report, the financial assessment, we aren't able to see any of them. Is that right? Or are we?
No, so wasn't a forensic. Well, there's a whole load of case papers of which consideration of the cash flows and so on were part of.
Yeah, I'm just saying generally, the licensing application, the forensic accounting report, we can't see them. Okay. There was a forensic accounting report there.
Well, there were case papers, wasn't a specific forensic accountancy report.
Okay.
We have, so we have it. We had input from across the commission.
Okay.
The other thing to bear in mind in terms of any disclosure, and you might find this in relation to other things as well, if you also refer to the case of the insolvency service. So the insolvency service will make a determination if they think they've seen evidence of fraud. To be honest, much as people say fraud and things so, we have not seen evidence that indicates fraud. We've seen evidence that we think indicates other things, which is why it's referred to insolvency service. They will look at whether the directors were competent, whether they behaved reasonably, whether they caused the collapse of the company, should they be struck off, should they be prosecuted, etc. Well, we've been speaking to the insolvency service for a while, it's what the chief executive speak. They'll have to get stuff from Jersey and they'll make determinations what to do.
Clearly, I mean, the administrators are looking into that side of things as well.
Yeah, and I've spoken to the administrators sometimes as well, as we have.
So the insolvency service liaising with Begbies then?
I don't know what they're doing
Okay.
because of course we wouldn't be party to that, so they will take their case forward and we wouldn't be able to interject with that. But they'll do an initial assessment based on the evidence that's shared, and then they'll decide A, whether they take the case forward, or B, if they do, then investigate it. It'll end up wherever it ends up. And that could be in a number of consequences. One of the things we get asked about is why is it possible for other people to be appearing in companies where they haven't been struck off?
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Sure, well, that's just standard corporate law as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know you know that.
But I think that shows that
Sorry.
a lot of people who did invest didn't really have much information around corporate law and things like that. I think you get people like that. The ignorant to negatives,
It's not very naive.
which hopefully isn't reflective of the community as a
but-
whole.
Sorry, just
yeah.
to put on the table, we actively do not condone and have always discouraged personal
Yeah.
abuse.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
unfortunately, we
that's
can't control it all, but we have done that. We've said it on Twitter.
Yeah, we've said, look, public sector staff are
Yeah.
off limits. It's unacceptable to
It's
be.
a very emotive subject, and
Of course.
unfortunately, the anonymity of social media lends itself to people stepping over a line they've never crossed if they meet in person.
We get it all the time.
Well, it's terrible and it's not right, obviously. So
Just one last thing, based on the letters and notwithstanding the report didn't go to the extent that you're saying it did, which it didn't. I personally believe there was more, but we don't think it's not in the report, but there were failings identified. Will you apologise for those failings, for the devastation that was flowed from them, partly?
I thought you'd asked me that at the beginning of the meeting.
we thought we'd wear you down from the hours first.
And I guess I'd add to that, I felt the comments about the bets being lost is maybe something that could be added to that if you were going to consider it, because I felt that was not appropriate.
I don't think I've ever talked about bets being lost. I talked about the money being lost.
More than afford to lose, yeah. I think that's
Yeah.
it,
You said the same thing in the podcast as well. Don't bet more than afford to lose.
Yeah, but then I didn't use that as a like kind of justification for massive regulatory evasion.
So what I clarified in the book, and I stand by, and it's in the letters, one of the things that really, really worries me, and what has made this so much worse than what would have been very, very bad anyway, is the amounts of money that people put in that they cannot live without. The house deposits, wedding deposits, life savings, ISAs. That's my concern, and that's what I've been talking to others in government banks. And about other products that I see now, because I look at what's going on social media, and people who are heavy into football index are now tweeting about being heavy into so rare.
Yeah, and crypto.
I'm really, really worried, and crypto, well,
It's all crypto.
and I'm really, really worried about people doing that. And the point that I'm trying to make, which is lost in people deciding to interpret in different ways, and I clarified in the blog, I said, no, people are not responsible for the company collapsing. I'm not saying people deserve to lose money, far from it. What I'm saying is, in any when people are saying, I took faith because it was regulated with the Gambling Commission, there's a certain contradiction in that. Nobody should be putting those levels of money into a gambling product.
But you're saying that to people that came across something that looked like it was yield generating stock market trading that had your commission's license on it. I agree with you.
But I'm sure I know you'll understand the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I understand
You
it
wouldn't
now
say
you
to
say
someone, if they put money into a financial services company, into an investment, and they
People trade on
they-
Betfair with hundreds of thousands
Yeah,
of
but if
pounds.
you put it into a financial instrument, and then something similar happened where they lost all their money, you wouldn't be saying, don't put money into an investment you can't afford to lose.
But I think the point was that-
For a
that's a very
gambling
different
product.
Yeah, I think
No,
what. Can I just clarify?
understand
Because the bets
sensitivity,
themselves weren't
but
lost,
for any
right?
gambling product, you'd have to say, please don't bet more than you can.
I think what people were saying was that they understood it was regulated by the Gambling Commission.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I think that's what you just said, isn't it? And actually, by that remit, they knew then it was a gambling product and shouldn't. I invested a lot of money, but I can afford to pay my mortgage, to get married if I choose to get married, and all those things. What I didn't do was use it as a savings account where people were dipping in and out on a monthly basis. They get paid, they'd whack it all in, and then drip feed it out. And that was never.
We've seen
should have happened.
quite a lot of.
That's the
So,
point.
and that's really my point. And it is a really difficult one. And I thought long and hard. We had a lot of conversations about what we needed to say and what it would be irresponsible not to say or irresponsible to say. I don't believe for a second that people who put money into Football Index deserve to lose it, or they are at fault for the fact that they did lose money. And I'm not talking about bets being lost. And I've always said, we don't know the outcome of that. We simply don't
Never will,
know.
probably.
And lots of people tweeting now about, Sancho, that might have been a close shot, and all of that stuff. We just don't know. Right? We don't know what would have happened. It doesn't, it matters, but in a sense it doesn't in relation to this. My concern is when I'm seeing people talking about huge amounts of money, life-changing amount of money, the distress it causes them, that's gone, and what they needed it for. It's a really tough message to not upset people with. If that was the case, it shouldn't have been in there in the first place. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, which people will violently disagree with, but I cannot, as a chief executive regulator, not see that issue and not try to comment. And I try not to say very much about it, because otherwise it does become, and I know people feel I'm victim blaming, well, I'm not. But it is something I am really seriously worried about, because there are, God knows how many other products we are seeing, which many of them don't come under our remit.
But if you were seriously worried when you were intervening, why didn't you protect them?
I'm talking about me arriving, after this and looking at what happened, reading the report, seeing the stuff that people have put on social media, and I exclude all the silliness and the nonsense that people put out there. When you look at the core of what some people are saying, and I imagine what those conversations all must be like, for those who are even having those conversations, because clearly some have been told their other halves, their families, what's happened. You look at that, and what worries me is what happened with this product and could happen with others, is people putting in amounts of money that just simply can't be